What if you could step back in time and talk with some of Kansas City's most historic figures? The innovators and achievers who left their mark on our town, on our nation. What would you ask if you could meet the past? This week, Crosby chats with Arthur Stillwell, founder of the Kansas City Southern Railway and builder of over 2,300 miles of railroad across the country, founding more than 40 cities along the way.
Some of you will know some of the history of the Southwest and Kansas City's connection to the Southwest. Know that the first European in Kansas was not a Frenchman or an Anglo or a German, but was in fact a Spaniard. It was either Coronado or Cabeza de Vaca. And the trails that they blazed in the 1520s and the 1540s became ultimately the trails that we know as the Santa Fe Trail, the Chisholm Trail. But also out there is another trail, and it's a trail that was created by another visionary who, like Coronado, was looking for a Gran Quivira, an El Dorado. And that man who created that dream is here with us tonight, and his name is Arthur Stillwell. Please welcome the Prince of Promoters, Arthur Stillwell. Mr. Stillwell, it's a pleasure to have you here. And I want to take you back a little over 100 years ago to a dinner that was held in Kansas City at the Midland Hotel, not far from here, February 10th, 1900, in a year that was perhaps the end of the worst year of your life, as one railroad was taken from you, and yet perhaps also the greatest moment of your life as you unveiled a dream that was perhaps about the greatest of your adventures and ventures. What happened on that night of February 10th, 1900?
Well, I had just lost control of the Kansas City, Pittsburgh, and Gulf Railway. Today you would know it as the Kansas City Southern. I had had some shady characters from Wall Street who had done me out of what I had helped to create on behalf of Kansas City and the farmers of the Midwest. My friends here in Kansas City had a testimonial dinner for me. It was one of the best moments of my life. Until 1 a.m. the speeches went on, bucking me up and trying to make me feel good. And I did tell the gathering when I had a chance to speak that I would rather have friends in Kansas City than to be president of the Pittsburgh and Gulf Railway. But, I said, I had another plan. Don't feel too sorry for me. Because I already have a new vision that will bring the Pacific Ocean 400 miles closer to Kansas City. And there were a few quizzical looks around the audience, and the plan went on from there.
You were already promoting again a new railroad.
You know, it doesn't do any good, Crosby, to dwell on the failures of the past. You know, I have very strong opinions about the financial interests, the Wall Street interests who forced me out of the Kansas City, Pittsburgh, and Gulf, but what could be gained from holding a grudge?
This great visionary attitude that you've got, this get up and dust them off and get going again, that must come from somewhere. And you were an Eastern boy yourself, born in Rochester, New York.
My grandfather was the inspiration, really, for all of my business career. He was a boat owner on the Erie Canal. He ran packet boats on the canal. And later, he caught the wave of the railroads and became a significant investor in the New York Central Railroad.
And was a friend of Commodore Vanderbilt,
exactly,
was he not?
Exactly, because the Commodore was the moving force behind the New York Central Railroad. And so my grandfather, Hamblin Stillwell was his name. I was his first grandchild and his pet. And he would take me to New York City on his business trips, and on several occasions we actually did meet the Commodore.
In starting out, you were entrepreneurial from the very beginning. Tell us the story. You went to Virginia to follow a woman who became your wife,
That's right.
I believe.
Jenny Wood was the mistress of my heart from the moment I first laid eyes on her. She was a Rochester girl too, but her parents moved to Virginia. And so it was up to me to finagle a way to keep seeing her. I set out to sell advertising in railroad timetables. Now that doesn't sound like it would be terribly lucrative, but do you know that the railroads in the South in those days didn't even print timetables? I got myself an audience with a couple of railroad presidents in the South, and I told them that I will print your timetables for you and it won't cost you a dime. And they said, well, how are you going to do that? And I said, simple, I'll sell advertising in them. So I sold advertising. The advertisers in railroad timetables, of course, were mostly hotels and restaurants and things like that. So I was able to get free travel on the railroads because I had good connections there, and I was able to get free lodging and free meals, and that's how I got to see Jenny.
There's a woman behind everything, right? But you had many careers as a young man. You sold insurance. You were in the printing business. You invented some products in the insurance business.
That's right. Actually, a forerunner of the modern annuity was an invention of mine. And I took it to the president of the Travelers Insurance Company. I had been an Illinois agent for the Travelers in those days. So I took it to him, and he initially gave me sort of a cold shoulder. I was all of 25. And he said, well, young man, you may rest assured that when we want your advice on our insurance products, we shall humbly ask for it. And I said, no, hear me out, hear me out. And so in about a minute's time, I explained how the whole thing worked. And he called one of the actuaries, and they ran a few numbers on it, and they said, by God, this works. And so I negotiated a commission of 50 cents on every $1,000 of coverage that every Travelers agent sold on those policies.
And you made a great deal of money, but you decided that you didn't want to be a salesman for somebody else's product. Mm-hmm. But finally you landed in Kansas City, and despite all your eventual troubles and your attitude towards bankers, the approximate reason that you went to Kansas City is you founded a bank.
That's right, the Guardian Trust Company, and actually is the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Trust Company. We used it to develop residential real estate, mostly residential. There was some commercial. Residential real estate in those days, a typical house might be $5,000 or $10,000, and we devised a mortgage product such that you could buy the house for 20% down, pay off the balance over the succeeding 10 years, and the important thing was that if the borrower died during those 10 years, the debt was canceled. So there's actually an insurance component to all of this. We used to say that you can live in your endowment policy and raise chickens in its backyard.
So now you started out in Kansas City going for a railroad that was kind of a smaller railroad, maybe not quite a railroad, in fact, a belt line.
That's right. It was a gentleman by the name of E.L. Martin. He had been mayor of Kansas City at one time. And he said, well, I have a concession to build a belt railway around Kansas City. Now, Kansas City, of course, is a terminal for several railroads. 17 railroads came into town at that point. And so anyway, Martin comes to me and he says, Stillwell, I have to start building this railroad within 3 days or I'll lose the concession. That afternoon, we were down at Union Depot and on a train to Philadelphia, where I had some previous experience with the Drexel financial interests. When we got to Philadelphia, Martin was a little bit tired from the trip, and he said, I'm going to go check into the hotel. If you want to go to Drexel, go ahead and I'll catch up to you. By the time he caught up to me at the noon hour, I had already subscribed the entire issue. The Drexel people had bought everything, and that was the beginning of my railroading career.
Extraordinary. And this belt line also became more than the terminal and the switching place. You took it out to eastern Jackson County towards Independence, and you didn't want just transportation, you wanted to build a community. So you founded Fairmount Park.
That's right.
A really important place in the history of Kansas City. Tell us about your vision for Fairmount Park.
Well, Fairmount Park was intended as a weekend destination for travelers on the railroad. There wasn't as much traffic. We intended that much of the passenger traffic, most of the passenger traffic would be commuters. And that's fine for Monday through Friday, but what about the weekends?
And Fairmount Park was also called the Electric Park. It was you were big on electric lights and colored lights and the colored lights in the fountain. It was quite the place to be.
Absolutely, and you have to remember the time and place here. You know, it's the 1890s. Electricity is still fairly new. Most people don't have it in their homes yet, and people would come out to the park just to see the lights. It was a wonderful sight.
You're a man of constant ideas. At one point, you said, out of the mist of hypothesis came a tangible thought. And I like that phrase a lot, the mist of hypothesis. Where did these hypotheses of yours, these tangible thoughts coming from misty places, there are rumors that you had well, how should we say this? Help from realms beyond?
Well, on many key junctures, during my life, I have received visions that I can only conclude are from the spirit world. They don't come from any conscious thought of mine. And they often happen during the middle of the night, and I have found them to be quite reliable. One of the first times the brownies appeared to me was when we were seeking to build our railroad west from 2nd and Delaware. That had been the place from which it had built east. In order to do that, we needed to cross the Missouri Pacific Railroad tracks, but they wouldn't let us build a bridge over their tracks. Don't ask me why, but the brownies gave me to understand that the Missouri Pacific's assertion probably wasn't true. The brownies were right. We built the bridge. The bridge still exists, incidentally, but it doesn't exist in the original place. It was moved a few years ago. Do you know there's a footbridge behind Union Station that crosses over the railroad tracks?
And that's your bridge?
That's my bridge.
No kidding. And the brownies gave you an idea, a larger idea than a Kansas City idea. It was a Kansas City and Nevada and Fort Smith. What was that larger idea? You headed south from Kansas City with your railroad.
That's right. Initially, Mr. Martin had suggested that we build our railroad south into Bates County. There are some coal fields near Hume, Missouri, and I thought, well, yes, that's fine, but why don't we go to Joplin instead? Because Joplin had a higher grade of coal. They had lead they had zinc,
and
exactly.
Yeah, a lot of important metals.
That is what I told everyone for public consumption. That's what I told all of the investors. That's what I told the Drexels back in Philadelphia. But in the back of my head was something that the brownies had given me to understand, that one day we would actually go to the Gulf of Mexico.
And so you headed south, and you ran out of money, and you had a kind of extraordinary thought. You headed not to Philadelphia, where you'd raised a lot of money, not to New York, where a lot of money was. You headed to...
I headed to the Netherlands.
The Netherlands.
It was a very interesting time. This is 1893. Now, you all may remember that there was a huge panic that year. Most of it was caused by a speculative bubble that had swelled up in American railroads. So American financial houses weren't about to back any railroads in those days, and even the financial houses in Europe weren't too crazy about the idea. Anyhow, the brownies suggested to me that the Netherlands might be a good place. After trying unsuccessfully for several days to find interest, I suddenly recalled a man that I had met on shipboard about 8 years previous.
And you raised $3 million?
We raised $3 million in a matter of days, and were able to continue the road as far as Shreveport.
So you changed the name of the railroad from the Kansas City, Nevada, and Fort Smith to the Kansas City, Pittsburgh, and Gulf. Right. Yeah, and so you're headed towards the Gulf, and all along the way you're building these towns that are named. You may go through Missouri and Arkansas and Texas and Louisiana. You'll find there are a lot of Dutch names. Think about it. Mena, Arkansas. Mena is named after
Queen Wilhelmina.
Queen Wilhelmina. Pretty amazing thing. But the brownies came to you again.
We had been thinking all the while that we were building the railroad that we would go to Houston or Galveston. And in the strangest hunch I have ever had in my life, I had this vision of a terribly destructive storm on the Gulf. And we decided at that point, I decided, to build not to the Gulf itself, but to Lake Sabine, which is actually on the Gulf, straddling the Louisiana and Texas borders. And we built Port Arthur, Texas there, which I named for myself.
You know, modesty is a well-known trait of great entrepreneurs.
You know, I did want to mention one thing, because I need to give credit to my hunches here on this. My brownies, call them what you will. But, you know, we actually did have a significant storm when we reached the Gulf in 1897. 3 years later, a devastating hurricane struck Galveston, the place that we originally thought we would go. To this day, that Galveston hurricane is the most costly natural disaster in American history in terms of lives.
So
the brownies were right.
The brownies were right. And so all along this route, not just building a railroad, but building communities again. You brought apples to the Ozarks for people to plant and build community, and the strawberries to Arkansas. By this time, you developed some of those East Coast partners, some of those New York partners that maybe you tried to avoid by keeping the money in Kansas City, the Harrimans and the Thalmans of New York, and a guy named Bet-A-Million Gates. So how did you get involved with that guy, and what happened?
Once the railroad opened all the way to the Gulf, suddenly farmers in Nebraska and Kansas have a closer deep water port to ship their grain to. So they're making more money. Their profits per acre go up about 80 cents per acre. We have timber being harvested in Louisiana. R.A. Long's fortune really increases as a result of the railroad. But the problem is that we were creating an awful lot of traffic, and we didn't have enough cars to handle all of the traffic. We had become a victim of our own success, and so we needed capital, we needed financing, and I looked to Mr. Gates, Mr. Harriman, Mr. Thalman.
And they decided to put you into receivership, the railroad into receivership. And you fought that. And the first time that they tried to put you into receivership, you fought it. You went to Chicago and convinced George Pullman, who'd been a friend of yours growing up, right?
That's right. Well, actually, hadn't been a friend of mine. He had been a young protege of my grandfather's.
Right.
Suffice to say, that was enough for George Pullman. He opened his checkbook, and that was that.
So the first time you needed help, George Pullman was there for you. And we get to 1899 and 1900, and the crisis comes again. And this time, you go to Chicago again and talk to George Pullman again.
I had an appointment to see George Pullman. Actually, I had talked with him, and he had agreed, yes, we will lend you the money. And so I was on my way to Chicago to finalize the deal. And when I stepped off the train in Chicago, the newsboys were all holding the headlines aloft and saying, Mr. Pullman had died that afternoon.
Your savior, Pullman, is dead, and your nemesis, Bet-A-Million Gates, has got control of the railroad. He forces the Guardian Trust into bankruptcy over a $44 printing bill. And so again, let's go back to February 10th, 1900, and you have this vision. The brownies were involved again?
I will maintain that it was my hunches that had told me to build to Tabolobampo, and the attraction was that Tabolobampo is closer to Kansas City by 400 miles than San Francisco. So it's the closest point on the west coast. It's actually on the Gulf of California, but not too far from the open sea. So we thought this is a way not only to tap some of the tremendous mineral and timber resources of Chihuahua and Sinaloa, states in northern Mexico, but also to go on to the riches of the Orient.
How did you go about getting rights to go through Mexico in 1900?
Well, there's a very interesting story about that, Crosby, and my friends at the National Bank of Commerce actually helped me out, unbeknownst to me at the time. But the day after the testimonial dinner that we had here at the Midland Hotel, Mr. Rule and Mr. Woods at the
cashier of the bank,
exactly, at the National Bank of Commerce, said that they'd like to talk to me some more about this vision. And so I went. I had lunch with them. By the time we were done, we had already sold $500,000 worth of stock to those gentlemen, and I left almost immediately for a meeting with Mexican President Porfirio Diaz. And while I was on my way there, again, unbeknownst to me, Mr. Rule was wiring governors all over the Midwest and sort of smoothing my path for President Diaz.
And as it turns out, President Diaz himself was what was called in those days a científico, part of a modernizing Mexican trend, and he had an idea of going to the coast himself, building a railroad.
They wanted this railroad very much for themselves, and of course it would facilitate trade with the U.S.
And you're beginning to build a railroad. You build south of Wichita, you get into Oklahoma, into Texas. And by the way, the Oklahoma Territory was just being opened up at this point, so it's virgin territory. This is about the time of something we now know as the Mexican Revolution. Oops.
That's true, and here's another one for you that you may not believe, but Pancho Villa himself had been a contractor for the Kansas City, Mexico and Orient Railway.
Well, you thought he was, unlike some of your other contractors, a little greasy and dirty, and you had a famous car, your personal car, on the railroad, in which you had a $10,000 pipe organ, is that right?
That's right. It was a beautiful car. I had bought it at the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. It was a wonderful place to host people. It was good for impressing people. But Pancho Villa was quite another matter. He was so greasy and dirty, and it was all I could do to have anything to any association with him. So,
and so when he started on his rampage and being part of the Revolution, he attacked you.
He did. Well, not me personally, but he attacked the railroad several times. It was the beginning of a long decline for the Kansas City, Mexico, and Orient, I'm sorry to say.
And so you begin to put yourself into the hands, once again, God, I hate to say this, of the Eastern, and in this case, actually, the British financiers.
Yes, my investors did lose about $20 million in the Kansas City, Mexico, and Orient Railway. And the only thing I can say in my defense is that a revolution is an abnormal thing. I could show you 40 other companies that I started that up until the 1920s had reaped $160 million in profits and dividends for their investors.
Immediately after the receivership happened again, they came in and they took the railroad again. And so you gave a famous speech to the National Education Alliance, the NEA, and you said...
I talked about, I think that may have been the first time I ever used the term the cannibals of finance. They sort of eat their own. I went on to talk about how if the moneyed interests of New York, if the capital markets in New York were allowed to have their way, they would ruin the country in 2 weeks. All I was trying to do was to build a railroad to benefit other people, to benefit the farmers of the Midwest, to develop whole districts of Mexico that hadn't been developed before, and they were having none of it.
W.T. Kemper, my great-grandfather, ultimately became the receiver of the railroad.
Right.
He'd been a friend of yours, but he put your railroad...
He did, and I won't hold that against you, Crosby. Actually, I would have to say that Mr. Kemper, in all fairness, probably did the only thing that he could do. I think he tried to make a going concern of the Orient Railway in very trying times, and ultimately, he too failed. What I proposed to do with the Orient Railway was the same thing that I had done with the Kansas City, Pittsburgh, and Gulf, which later became the Kansas City Southern. I promised to undercut the rates of other existing railroads because I was able to provide a shorter haul for my customers.
And they hated you for it.
Of course they did.
And timing is everything sometimes in business. The Brownies had told you a little bit about the discovery that was just over the horizon, not the coal and the lead and the zinc that you knew about and you had headed for earlier, but another product that's become pretty important in our world.
There were tremendous oil deposits. And this is an interesting thing. There were oil deposits that were discovered in West Texas after I had lost control of the Orient. The spindle top gusher in East Texas along the Kansas City Southern Railway was discovered just the year after I lost control of that railroad. I have developed resources, and I knew this going in. I always knew that it was others who would benefit from these companies more than I did. I just never realized how much they would benefit.
Well, and I want it now, is a very personal moment for me. I want to thank you for creating this railroad, because my great-grandfather was able to buy up the stock. It went through a couple of receiverships in various ways, and right before the oil was discovered, he ended up owning most of it. And then the oil was discovered, and he sold it to the Santa Fe Railroad for huge profit. Thank you. Thank you. I do want to talk about the latter days of your life, because you didn't give up on life at all. The spirits were still with you. You wrote some books. You became a Christian Scientist, I think?
I had been a Christian Scientist actually since an early illness back in my 20s. But in no way did it seem to me inconsistent with my belief in the Brownies. And incidentally, these hunches of mine, I'm not alone in this. I'll have you know, for example, that Robert Louis Stevenson said that he often wrote under the influence of brownies. I don't know where he got that term. I don't know where I got the term, but we both use the same term somehow. No less a figure than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle a spiritualist of no mean distinction,
a regular correspondent of yours in your latter days,
said that no living man had had the psychic experiences of Arthur Stillwell.
You had an amazing life, as you say, that you created these incredible investments, and you like to say that you live your life so that your enthusiasm is contagious, and clearly you did that.
Absolutely. You know, Crosby, youth is a condition that we misinterpret. We think that youth is all about physical health and physical vitality, but you know, it is possible to live and grow young.
Your sublime self-confidence, your visionary entrepreneurship, accompanied, of course, by spirits, embodying the Kansas City spirit, is a great thing. And I want to say thank you very much, Arthur Stillwell, for being our guest tonight.
Well, thank you, Crosby. Thank you. Arthur Stillwell is just a fascinating character because he's so unconventional. You know, I mean, what other business executive do you know of that gets his visions from the spirit world? You know, he's a very colorful character. He's borderline flamboyant, but not so flamboyant that people don't trust him. By all accounts, he had a remarkable knack for getting people to share in his dreams and to invest in his dreams. And a lot of local fortunes were founded on them.
To learn more about Arthur Stillwell, reading lists and more can be found at the Kansas City Public Library or at kclibrary.org.